All right, everybody, buckle up, because today we are going deep, deep, deep into some seriously tangled roots.
Roots.
Well, the idea of roots,
Yes.
specifically the idea of Europe having Christian roots. You know that whole concept.
Yeah, you hear that everywhere. Speeches, books, you name it.
Exactly. It's like this default setting for how we talk about Europe. But for this deep dive, we wanted to pick that apart a bit, see if it holds up under scrutiny.
Always a good idea. So where do we even begin with a topic this big?
Well, we found the perfect guidebook, actually. Sante Lesti's The Myth of Christian Roots.
Interesting choice. I'm familiar with Listy's work.
Yeah, so are we, and it's sharp stuff. What we loved is how they don't just take sides in the debate, they go back and unpack how this whole Christian roots idea even became a thing.
Good point. You can't have that argument unless everyone agrees on what Europe even is or is, right?
Exactly. And that's like point one in the book, this idea of Europe as one big cultural entity is way more recent than people think.
It's true. We're talking late 18th century, around the French Revolution, when this really starts bubbling up.
So are we saying Europe as a concept basically didn't exist before then?
Not quite. But this idea of a shared European identity, separate from just a bunch of kingdoms and empires, that's relatively new.
Which is wild because that's also when this Christian roots thing explodes, right?
Total connection, and Lesti makes that link so clearly. They actually dig up this crazy poem from 1795, the Lyonnais epic. Super obscure, but it shows how these ideas were there from the get-go.
Okay, so 1795. What's the context? What's this poem all about?
It's basically one giant lament about the French Revolution.
Ah, right. Talk about upheaval.
This poem goes hard, predicting the downfall of Europe, blaming it all on abandoning Christian faith.
Hold on. So this poem is straight up saying that Europe is doomed because of the French Revolution.
Pretty much. And it's less about, specific policies and more about a sense that the revolution ripped apart the fabric of society. This poem sees Christianity as holding that fabric together.
Interesting. So is this poet, what was their name again?
Pierre-Simon Ballanche.
Right, Ballanche.
Yeah.
Was he just some lone voice in the wilderness? Or was this a common sentiment at the time?
Not at all. Lesti connects this to the wider anxieties of the era. The French Revolution wasn't just political. It was a total earthquake for how people understood power, religion, everything.
Like the whole system was being questioned?
Exactly. And for someone like Ballanche, Christianity wasn't just about church on Sundays. It was the bedrock of legitimacy for monarchs, for social order, everything.
So when that gets challenged,
The whole thing feels like it's crumbling.
and Lesti backs this up with other thinkers too,
Oh yeah, people like Louis de Bernald, a staunch royalist, hated the revolution.
hated it enough to write a poem about it.
No, but he had some strong opinions. He said Europe's origin story was all about this fusion of the Roman Empire and the barbarian tribes who conquered it. But not just the military stuff. He specifically said it was about the Christian faith Rome adopted, and that this fusion is what gave monarchs their divine right to rule.
So basically the opposite of power to the people.
More like power granted by God through the church to your rightful king.
Handy how that works out.
It's a very clear example of how this Christian roots idea gets used for political ends.
Totally. But Lesti also talks about how it wasn't just the hardcore traditionalists who were into this, right?
Yeah.
Weren't the Romantics kind of obsessed with Christianity too?
In their own way, absolutely, but for different reasons.
Hit me with it.
So someone like Novalis, this German writer and philosopher, he initially saw the French Revolution as progress, hopeful,
Right.
But then things got messy, violent. The revolution kind of devoured its own. And that's when you see this longing for a different kind of Europe emerge.
Okay, so what did that look like? What was their ideal Europe?
They romanticized the heck out of the Middle Ages.
Knights in shining armor, that sort of thing?
Basically, they saw it as this time of spiritual and cultural unity. Everyone understood their place. They were united by faith.
And everyone always got along.
It was a very idealized view, for sure.
To put it mildly.
But it shows how Christian roots weren't just about politics, but also about this yearning for a lost golden age. A sense of shared European identity that went deeper than just borders and kings.
So we've got kings clinging to power, we've got artists longing for a simpler time, but it all comes back to this idea of a shared Christian past, right?
And it's about to get even more tangled up in art, in national identities, even colonialism. But that's a story for our next part.
So last time we left off with this idea of Christian roots being used to paint this picture of a unified, idealized Europe.
A Europe that probably never really existed, at least not in that way.
Probably not. But hey, a powerful image is a powerful image. And speaking of images, Lesti talks about how this bleeds into art, too.
A big time. Like, think about the painter Francesco Hayez.
Okay, refresh my memory.
Italian artist, early 1800s. His paintings are full of these scenes from a romanticized Christian past, knights, religious figures, all that good stuff.
So not just talking about Christian roots, but showing them.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about pretty pictures. This fed into a growing sense of nationalism, too.
Oh, yeah.
Lesti brings up Vincenzo Gioberti, a key figure in the Italian Risorgimento. That was the movement for Italian unification in the 19th century.
Right, right.
And Gioberti, he argued that Italy had this special destiny to, like, revive European civilization. Because of its Roman Catholic heritage, of course. He saw it as this direct link back to the Roman Empire, this glorious past that Italy could, quote-unquote, redeem.
So it's not just a shared European identity anymore, but national identities built on Christianity. Wow, that's potent.
And it gets used in some pretty uncomfortable ways, too. Lesti doesn't shy away from how this Christian roots narrative plays into colonialism.
Yeah, you can't talk about this stuff without talking about colonialism.
Because it's all connected. The whole idea of Europeans spreading civilization, which just happened to look a lot like imposing their own values on everyone else.
And Christianity becomes the justification.
Bringing light to the heathens, that whole thing. It's a direct continuation of how they saw their own history with Christianity. But even as this is happening, there are these internal tensions within the idea of Europe's Christian roots.
Oh, spill the tea. Who's fighting with whom?
Well, you've got someone like Joseph de Maistre, for example. Deeply Catholic, but not into the whole romantic, feelings-based Christianity.
No fuzzy feelings allowed.
Not for him. He saw the church as this powerful institution, crucial for order, for keeping those monarchs in check.
Wait, so he liked monarchs?
He felt they were necessary, but also that they needed guidance, which the church could provide. It's a different take on Christian roots. Less about sentimentality, more about raw power, I guess you could say.
Fascinating. So even back then, Christian roots could mean a whole bunch of things depending on who you asked. And then, boom, 20th century hits. Wars, communism, secularism. Did this whole idea just fade away?
You'd think so, right. But it's surprisingly resilient. It morphs, adapts to these massive changes. And one of the biggest turning points, according to Lesti, was the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s.
Okay, so the Catholic Church is trying to figure out its place in a world that's rapidly changing.
Exactly. Less about clinging to the past, more about, okay, how does Christianity fit into the future of Europe? And that's where things get really interesting.
All right, so the 20th century throws everything up in the air. The church is trying to modernize.
Yeah.
Where does this idea of Christian roots fit into all of that?
Well, this is where Lesti's argument gets really interesting, really relevant to the world we live in now. They talk about how even as the church is trying to figure out this new, more secular world, the idea of Christian roots doesn't go away. It gets picked up by political movements, especially on the right.
Because of course it does. We see that happening even more today.
Exactly. And Lesti brings up figures like Viktor Orban in Hungary, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, both leaning hard into this idea of Europe's Christian roots.
And it's not even subtle, right? It's very much code for a certain kind of politics, usually with some not-so-great undertones about who does and doesn't belong in Europe.
It's a very particular vision of Europe they're pushing. And it's not just politicians either. Lesti even talks about Pope Benedict XVI tapping into this idea, though in a less explicitly political way.
Right. Benedict was more about the theology of it all.
Exactly. Lesti argues that Benedict was deeply worried about what he saw as a moral decline in Europe. Too much individualism, too much anything goes secularism. And for him, going back to those Christian roots, it wasn't just about which religion was dominant. It was about getting back to what he saw as a more solid ethical foundation.
So similar language, very different goals.
That's one way to put it. And of course, not everyone was thrilled with this approach either, telling people they need to sign on to a whole religion to have morals. Not exactly a winning strategy for everyone.
Yeah, a bit of a tough sell. So where does that leave us? Because then Pope Francis comes in, and he's a whole different ballgame, right?
Totally. And this is where Lesti's book really shines, because they trace how Francis navigates this minefield. At first, it seems like he's on the same page, talking about Europe's Christian heritage, all that.
Right, so we're thinking, okay, same playbook, different pope.
Right. But then, 2016, he gives this speech, and it throws everyone for a loop. He talks about Europe needing to rediscover its values. Solidarity, openness, hospitality, all crucial, he argues, for welcoming refugees, migrants. But he never actually mentions Christianity directly.
Wow, he really just went there, huh?
It's a power move. He's basically saying these values, the things Europe should be about, they're not exclusive to any one religion. They're universal.
Which, let's be real, is a pretty bold thing to say when the whole Christian roots debate is so heated.
It's a huge shift in emphasis. And Lesti argues that this is Francis trying to disentangle these ideas. He doesn't want to erase history, but he also refuses to let it be used to justify closing doors, putting up walls.
So it's less about Christian roots and more about, what, European values or something.
You could say that, though even that gets tricky. Because in a later speech, 2017, he does acknowledge Christianity's influence on European culture.
Okay, so he's not erasing history.
Right. But he immediately follows it up with this warning. This heritage, it can't be used to justify shutting people out, being intolerant. He even says, straight up, a closed-off, fearful Europe is a sick Europe.
Wow. So he's not just sidestepping the issue, he's actively pushing back against it, trying to, reclaim that Christian roots idea, but give it a whole new meaning.
That's exactly Lesti's point. Francis is walking this tightrope, acknowledging the past, but refusing to let it be weaponized.
It's a really nuanced take on a really loaded topic.
And it's so relevant to how we understand Europe today.
Yeah.
Because that debate, what does it mean to be European? Who gets to decide? What values are we basing that on? That's still raging.
It's the question, isn't it? And honestly, after this deep dive, I'm not sure we have any easy answers.
Me neither. But we've got centuries of debate to learn from.
That we do. So to everyone listening, next time you hear that phrase, Christian roots, don't just let it slide by. Think about what it means, what it's being used to justify, and who might be getting left out of that picture.
Because history is never just about the past. It's about how we use it to make sense of the present.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So keep those critical thinking caps on, everyone, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.